We want to now take a deep dive into what the president was holding up in the Rose Garden. It's a list of countries and the tariffs he is imposing on those countries. There are questions about how the Trump administration arrived at those tariffs on said countries in the first place. So let's try to explain. Phil Mattingly is here. Walk us through. I have to say, just looking at that, I get a little bit of a stomach ache because this whole situation, as somebody who hates math, scares me.
Just the visual itself is not helping us out.
This is the formula that they use to get to the list that they have and the tariffs that are happening.
And by the way, if you're watching and looking, you're not supposed to understand what this means. In fact, that's kind of part of the play here. But let me explain what it actually means, because I think, as Dana was pointing out, the critical question yesterday when we were looking at the chart and when we were actually looking at the numbers, like the 34% number is the actual tariff that the U.S. is putting on China, adding others on top of it, stacking them together. And how they got there, given the fact it didn't correlate with the actual tariffs we know China has on the U.S. or any other country has on the U.S., was a real question that everybody's trying to figure out, particularly because they are so high and they are so dramatic. So let's take Vietnam. You mentioned Vietnam earlier in the show, which is obviously a huge exporter to the United States because U.S. people buy Vietnamese goods. What does it actually mean? Trading between the U.S. and Vietnam, this is based on 2024 census data, which is the data that was utilized to come up with the calculation. Vietnam exports $136.6 billion in goods to the U.S. The U.S. exports $13.1 billion in goods to Vietnam. Now, how did they get to the 90%, which they cut in half to 46%? What they did is they subtracted the Vietnamese goods bought by the U.S., $136.6 billion. Total U.S. goods bought by Vietnam, and ended up with $123.5 billion. Now, the way they actually got to the 90% number is they did 123.5 divided by 136.6, which equals 0.90 or 90%.
And then half of that.
And then, because of the benevolence of President Trump, as he kind of laid it out, then they cut that in half. Now, the big question, of course, is that's not necessarily a number or a methodology that economists could identify with. In fact, the most interesting moment of the night, throughout the course of the night last night, was economists of all sides, all ideologies, Republican and Democrat, staring at the methodology and saying, that's not how this is supposed to work. It underscores, though, trade deficits in the mind of the president, but also in the mind of his team, are absolutely essential to how they view things, and the view that they don't think any of those economists, Republican or Democrat, have gotten it right up to this point, and they're going a different route.
And that's what this, first of all, don't get rid of that yet, because I'm not going to have to call you out on this.
Yeah, what did I do?
I have terrible handwriting. What is this?
That's a 9.
Okay.
Obviously.
And what's happening over
here?
here?
So 0.9, which then goes to, in my head, it made a lot of sense.
I couldn't help myself.
That's fine. That's fair.
But the fairness question.
Yeah.
That is, we talked about this earlier in the show, that is the kind of North Star for Donald Trump that is driving all of this trade policy that he has wanted to do and now he is doing. And that helps answer the why to this formula that you just laid out for our viewers?
What's most important is when the president said he loves reciprocity and would say it over and over again, sometimes say it in hushed tones, he framed things as if it was a tariff for tariff type of deal. What he wanted to do is if Vietnam has X tariff on X product to that the U.S. is exporting to them, we are going to match that one-to-one. That's not what happened. And I think this is important to note here because in the executive order that laid out the pathway where we landed yesterday, they made clear it wasn't just about tariffs, it was about non-tariff barriers. In fact, when you talk to Trump's economic team, they focus on that far more than they focus on the actual tariffs themselves by product. Here's the other issue. Doing tariff by tariff calculations, product by product, for any nation, particularly 185, almost impossible given the timeline they were working with, and they got at that last night. The USTR, in the statement laying out the methodology, said while individually computing the trade deficit effects of tens of thousands of tariff, regulatory, tax, and other policies in each country is complex, if not impossible, they thought this was the best way to get at the most central issue for them in their minds. The reality is, no one could really identify with a linear methodology how to define non-tariff barriers for every single country in different regions that do different products. They also need a lot of staff to do something like this. That's why they say, if not impossible, you saw the methodology, economists scoff at it, but it is the reality, and it's now the basis for the 60 countries that are being hit with reciprocal tariffs.
Absolutely incredible. Thank you so much for explaining that, Phil.
Well, we knew tariffs were coming, but now that we know specifics, shockwaves are rippling through the global economy and American businesses. Restoration Hardware's CEO Gary Friedman was in the middle of his quarterly earnings call when the tariff news broke, and this is what he said. O expletive starts with an S, you can guess it, as he watched the company's stock plunge. He's not alone in that sentiment, though Mark Zandi from Moody's Analytics used more words. He's sounding the alarm, saying if the administration follows through on these higher tariffs without significant carve-outs, it's going to be very difficult for the economy to digest this. A recession seems more likely than not. Now, to be clear, a recession doesn't happen overnight. So let's look at previous recessions since the 1950s. You can see the unofficial definition of a recession is back-to-back quarterly contractions in real gross domestic product. But even that isn't a guarantee because economic data is constantly revised. So who makes the official call here? Well, it's actually a small group of economists at the National Bureau of Economic Research. It's a private nonprofit organization that looks at several things, including GDP, inflation, and employment numbers. And the data has to show a, quote, significant decline in economic activity that is spread across the economy and lasts more than a few months. It's a retrospective look. That means the economy can be in a recession before we can officially call it one. So long story short, we are ways away from any recession call because we won't know the estimated GDP numbers for the first quarter of 2025 until the end of the month. We also don't know if or for how long these tariffs will remain in place, because those tariffs that were announced yesterday don't officially take effect for 6 days. And there is a lot of recession talk, but what we're also looking out for is stagflation. You, of course, know inflation. Well, stagflation is high inflation plus high unemployment and also slower growth. It's a triple threat nightmare scenario for policymakers because any lever they try to pull to remedy one thing ends up hurting somewhere else. So there's really no other way to put it. It's time to buckle up, Boris.
Let's discuss this and more with Scott Lincicome. He's the Vice President for General Economics at the Cato Institute. Scott, thank you so much for being with us. Before we get into the potential for stagflation and the details of this policy overall, I wonder if you agree with the underlying idea that U.S. trade deficits are, as the president has described them, a national emergency.
Most definitely not. I don't think there's really a serious economist out there that would say that trade deficits are driven even by trade policies, that instead they're driven by underlying macroeconomic factors. And certainly not something that is a national emergency requiring these massive new import taxes.
So you reject the view that the administration has that for national security, the U.S. needs a booming industrial base, and the way to do it, the way to rebuild it, as it's been decimated over the years, is to incentivize domestic production of goods via tariffs, via tax breaks for companies. You reject that notion.
Well, I agree that the United States needs a thriving defense industrial base, but the idea that these tariffs are going to produce that industrial base is just wildly mistaken. The reality is that about half of everything we import into the United States today are capital goods, equipment, raw materials that American manufacturers need to remain globally competitive. When you tax those things, you actually harm American manufacturers. Throw in the inevitable foreign retaliation against American exports, the massive amounts of uncertainty that are baked into all of this, with the president effectively flipping tariffs on and off like a switch in the Oval Office. And this is just simply not an environment that's conducive to boosting the manufacturing sector. And I'd actually expect at the end of the day that it's a net drag on manufacturing output investment, not a boost.
That is fascinating. When you talk about foreign retaliation, I guess the argument from folks around President Trump and even President Trump himself would be that a lot of these countries, whether adversaries or allies, are already making it more difficult for American exporters. And so this is just getting even with folks that either bend the rules to their will or don't follow the rules at all. What would you say?
Well, there's two big problems with that. First, if you look at President Trump's tariffs, they apply to countries with whom we already have free trade agreements and that have really low trade barriers. Singapore, we have an FTA with, it has 0% tariffs, and yet they're suddenly getting a 10% reciprocal rate. So that's just a bit disingenuous at best, I think. The other big point, though, is we again have to ask, will import restrictions actually boost American exports? And the economics literature here is clear, past history is clear, that tariffs are actually going to undermine exports. They're going to actually do the opposite of what President Trump says he wants. And that's even before we get to the retaliation that's inevitably going to come.